Story 1. We weren't alone. In the spring of 2014, I decided to take my son on his first turkey hunting trip. He had just turned 12, and it was the perfect age to start learning the ways of the woods. I chose a remote campsite, 3 to 4 miles uphill from any paved road. The site was more of a cleared spot than it was an actual campsite, but nevertheless, it would work. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun still warm on our backs as we set up camp. The clearing was surrounded by dense forest, and the sounds of nature were a constant backdrop to our activities. By the time we had our tent up and dinner cooked, the sun had set, and the crackling fire was our only source of light. As the night deepened, I told my son it was time to turn in, hinting at the long day ahead that required an early start if we were to have any chance of bagging a turkey. He nodded, understanding, and crawled into his sleeping bag. As for myself, I wasn't quite ready to surrender to sleep, so I flicked on my small battery-powered lamp and pulled out a book, intending to indulge in some light reading to wind down from the day's excitement. The quiet rustling of pages filled the tent as I lost myself in the story. We hadn't been settled for more than 10 minutes, when a sudden shift in the atmosphere stole my attention from the book. An inexplicable sense of unease washed over me, a prickling sensation that something wasn't quite right. Deep down inside, I began to feel like we weren't alone. My focus shifted from my book to the world outside our tent, and I began to listen intently for anything I could hear. After a short while, I began to hear what I believed to be footsteps. They were deliberate, heavy with intent, circling our camp like a relentless, pacing intruder. The tranquility of my earlier reading was gone, replaced by a growing dread that my son and I were out in the middle of nowhere with an unknown something or someone. My son's voice, tinged with sleep and confusion, broke the silence. "Dad, what's that noise?" I tried to keep my voice steady, to mask the growing fear inside me. "It's nothing, just a deer or something. Go back to sleep." He believed me, or at least he wanted to. Within minutes he was back asleep, but I lay there wide awake, every sense straining in the darkness. The footsteps continued, a taunting, terrifying presence. I thought of every possible explanation, each more implausible than the last. Maybe it was a bear or a deer, but I'd been in the woods long enough to know that whatever this was, it was bipedal. The two-legged gait was undeniably human. Who in the hell would be stalking around our campsite in the middle of nowhere, I thought to myself. Not wanting to alarm my son, I remained quiet, but continued to listen. Eventually, after about 20 minutes or so, the footsteps began to recede, and finally made their way off into the distance. The next night was a repeat of the first, only this time I had moved our tent closer to the fire, a pitiful barrier against whatever was out there. Again, my son fell asleep quickly, while I lay awake, listening as the footsteps returned. This time, the unnerving presence outside made me decide that it was necessary to confront whoever was lurking around our campsite. I slowly unzipped the entrance to our tent and stepped out, trying not to wake my son. Crouching by the tent flap, I paused, straining my ears to pinpoint the direction of the footsteps. Beside me, I had my .40 caliber Smith & Wesson, and in my other hand, a flashlight. I waited, listening intently for the right moment, then sprang up and shone my flashlight toward the source of the noise. About 40 feet away, just inside the wood line, stood a massive figure. He towered over 6.5 feet tall and appeared to weigh around 300 pounds, dressed entirely in black with a hood drawn over his head. In a bizarre, terrifying manner, he had his back turned to us and was now utterly still. "Who's out there?" I shouted. "You don't need to be coming around our campsite." The man remained motionless, his back still facing us. "I'm armed," I yelled, but received no response. Inside the tent, my son, now wide awake, called out in a worried whisper, "Who is it, Dad?" But I kept my focus on the silent figure, ignoring my son's queries. "Hey!" I called out again, my flashlight beam steadfast on him, but still, no response came. My son, starting to panic, tugged at my leg. "What do you see? Who is it?" he whispered. I spared him a brief glance. "Get back inside the tent, son. Everything is fine," I reassured him, albeit with a wavering confidence. Reluctantly, he crawled back inside. When I turned my attention back to where the man had been standing, my heart skipped a beat. He had completely vanished, gone without a trace. I swept my flashlight back and forth, searching, but found nothing. It seemed impossible for a man that large to have left so quickly and silently. Enough was enough. I hurried my son into the truck, and we drove away from the campsite, leaving the eerie silence and the night behind us. The next day, I returned to collect our tent and belongings. Surprisingly, everything was untouched, as if the night's events had been a figment of my imagination. But I knew it wasn't. I know what I saw, and I know what we experienced. It was the last time we ever visited that campground, a decision sealed by the inexplicable events of that unsettling night. All these years later, I still struggle to figure out exactly who or what we encountered those 2 nights. It was definitely a person, I'm certain of it. I know what I saw. Yet, his peculiar behavior and abrupt disappearance left me in a state of confusion, causing me to question whether there was something more to the encounter. The way he stood so unnaturally still, how he vanished without a trace. It was all so strange. The encounter has challenged my understanding of reality, leaving me to contemplate whether there are deeper, unseen mysteries that reside in the woods. Story 2. Something didn't want us there. In the summer of 2010, I embarked on a solitary camping trip to a remote campsite in Wisconsin. With my loyal dog Troop by my side, we set out for a midsummer adventure, eager to explore new territories. Little did I know this excursion would be a chilling encounter I'd never forget. The first anomaly struck as soon as we arrived. Troop, typically brimming with excitement, hesitated to leave the car. His unusual behavior unsettled me, but I dismissed it, attributing his reluctance to the new surroundings. As we settled in, his unease gradually subsided, and we resumed our usual camping activities. But the serenity of the day did nothing to forecast the eerie events that would unfold. That evening, as the sun began to dip out of sight, an inexplicable sense of dread enveloped me. Troop's gaze fixated on the dense forest that bordered our campsite, and at times, he would let out a low growl. His behavior was out of character. He was typically a calm, collected dog, and didn't have bouts of anxiety or fear. Yet, there he was, quivering beside me, every fiber of his being on high alert. The night progressed, and so did the intensity of Troop's distress. He would constantly perk up, his eyes darting towards the shadowy woods. I tried to reassure him, to convince myself that his reactions were baseless, but the seed of fear had already been planted. As we retreated into our tent, the comforting glow of the campfire did little to alleviate the growing tension. Hours into the night, a chilling disturbance shattered our fragile peace. The sound of an unfamiliar, unsettling dialect echoed around the campsite, its source unseen but unmistakably close. It was as if 2 people, or what I believed to be people, were conversing in a tongue beyond my comprehension. I'd never heard anything like it before. My mind raced with possibilities. What were they discussing? Who were they? Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, I mustered the courage to confront the unknown. "Who's out there?" I called out. The response was immediate and terrifying. A silence, oppressive and total, enveloped the campsite. It was as if the very air had been sucked from the clearing. With Troop's whimpering as my only companion, I ventured a peek outside, my flashlight piercing the darkness in search of answers. There was nothing, only a dark abyss, accompanied by silence. Not knowing what else to do, I climbed back into the tent and listened. The silence continued, and eventually fatigue took over, and Troop and I both fell asleep. The next morning, Troop was back to his lively self, and it was like the events from the previous night had never happened. I was feeling much better too, and decided that we could pass the day with a nice hike. I packed a bag, grabbed some food and water, and we set off down a winding trail. As the sun began to dip, Troop and I made our way back to our campsite. The air, usually filled with the tranquil sounds of nature, grew eerily silent, and Troop's sudden whimpering and restless pacing indicated that something was amiss. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach as we moved closer to where we had set up camp. The sight that greeted us was beyond comprehension. Our tent, which I had meticulously secured earlier, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, something unidentifiable was lodged in a nearby tree. My heart raced as Troop descended into a full-blown panic, his cries echoing my own fear. Despite every instinct telling me that something was terribly wrong, we had no choice but to get back to camp, and so we continued on. As we got closer, I realized, with a sinking heart, that the object in the tree was the tattered remains of our tent. How could this be? The day had been almost entirely devoid of wind, and I had anchored the tent firmly to the ground. The torn fabric and shattered poles hanging from the branches painted a picture of violent destruction that was caused by something other than the wind. Could it have been a bear? Troop was beside himself, so much so that I had to leash him and almost drag him back into camp. Approaching the ruins of our campsite, a deep demonic growl emanated from the forest, freezing both Troop and me in our tracks. Whatever it was, it didn't feel like it was a bear, and it certainly wasn't human. This was something else, something far more sinister, something that didn't want us there. At that moment, I felt that it was time to leave. My hands trembled as I frantically searched my bag for my keys, only to find them missing. It was then that the terrible mistake I had made earlier in the day dawned on me. My keys, our only means of escape, had been left inside the tent. The growling intensified, now accompanied by the same unsettling chattering that I had heard the previous night. Whatever was making the sounds was getting very, very close. With no time to spare, I acted on impulse, leaping towards the tangled mess of fabric above in the tree. I missed on the first try, but on the second try, my fingers grasped the edge of the torn tent. I pulled it down with all my might, sending a shower of debris around me. Troop's terror-filled crying urged me to hurry as I sifted through the wreckage for my keys, but they were nowhere to be found. Turning my attention to the now empty patch of ground where our tent once stood, I scanned back and forth, praying for a miracle. It was then that I saw them, resting on the ground a few feet away from where the tent had been. I snatched them up, grabbed Troop, and raced towards the car, the sounds of the growling and chatter reaching a fever pitch. As soon as the car roared to life, a massive branch crashed into the windshield. The impact sounded like a gunshot in my tiny car, and I screamed as I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, throwing dirt and rocks as we fled from the nightmare that had overtaken our campsite. As we sped away from the campsite, the forest and its unseen horrors receded into the darkness behind us. The adrenaline coursing through my veins began to ebb, and it was replaced by a deep, pervading sense of relief. Troop, still trembling beside me, gradually calmed as the familiar lights of civilization came into view. In the days that followed, the ordeal was hard to shake. What in the hell had we encountered out there? A few weeks later, I made a decision. I decided that I wasn't going to let the fear of the encounter deter my love for the outdoors. Determined, I visited a local sporting goods store in search of a new tent, one that could replace the shredded remains of my previous one. While perusing the aisles, absorbed in comparing features and materials, a man, likely in his mid-50s, casually passed by. He paused, noting my interest, and commented, "That's a good one. That's the one I use." Acknowledging him, I replied, "Yeah, I'm in need of a sturdy one. Something tore up my old tent pretty bad." "Something?" he replied back with a curious tone. I hesitated, wary of sounding crazy, but something in his earnest gaze compelled me to share snippets of my harrowing experience. As my story unfolded, I noticed a distinct shift in his expression, from polite interest to a grave, knowing look. For a moment there was a heavy silence between us, filled with unspoken understanding. He seemed to wrestle with his thoughts, as if on the verge of revealing a secret of his own. Finally, locking eyes with me, he delivered a somber warning. "I used to go to that place you're talking about. I don't anymore, and you'd be smart to not go back out there again." With those parting words and a solemn nod, he turned and disappeared around the corner. The wilderness, with all its beauty and mystery, appears to hold something sinister that we don't quite understand. The warning from the man echoed in my mind as I left, tent in hand. My days in the woods weren't done, but I'd heed the man's warning and never go back into that part of the woods ever again. Story 3, Solo Camping Nightmare. Being alone out at my secluded camping spot in the late spring used to be the very definition of peace for me. The vast silence, the separation from civilization, it was a soothing retreat to my cluttered mind. The isolation was a friend, and my tent was a place where I could hear myself think, where I could breathe. But that perspective changed a few years back when I realized just how dangerous it could be as well. Years ago, on a trip just like any other, I made my way out to the camping site. The first day was pure bliss. I set up my tent and listened as a gentle rain made its way in. With a warm cup of coffee in hand, I watched the gentle dance of the raindrops as they trickled down from the green expanse above. It was moments like these that I sought, a simple pleasure that city life couldn't offer. The next afternoon, as the rain had finally ceased, a restlessness took hold of me. I was pulled to do some exploring, to take in the serene, green-clad scenery, to be a part of that pristine wilderness, even if just for a few hours. I packed some supplies into a bag, a habit of preparedness I never neglected, and covered myself to protect against the lingering dampness. Stepping outside, I was greeted by a silence so profound it was almost a physical presence. I made my way through the wet underbrush, eager to embrace the day that awaited me. I had been exploring a few trails and a few back roads on the mountain, enjoying the solitude and the stark beauty of the spring landscape, when my adventure took an unexpected turn. A stream, swollen by the recent rains, had flooded the path I was walking on. Rather than turning around and heading back, I made a terrible decision. I attempted to cross it, telling myself I had the skills to navigate through the unpredictable wilderness. But as I stepped into the water, the current was stronger than I anticipated, sweeping my feet from under me. Terror ran through me, and instinct took over. I clung to a nearby branch, pulling myself out of the water. I stood there for a moment, trying to process the events that had just rapidly unfolded. I was okay, just a few scrapes and a jolt to my pride, but I was angry at myself for taking such an unnecessary risk. With a heavy sigh, I decided to walk back to the tent and dry off. As I made my way along the mud-covered path back to the tent, an unsettling sight caught my eye and quickened my pulse. Footprints. They marred the otherwise untouched canvas of the forest floor, a stark and unnerving indication that I was not alone out here. As I got within sight of the tent, the footprints veered off, darting into the woods that hugged the boundaries of the clearing. It was deliberate, the way they suddenly disappeared into the tree line, as if whoever made them didn't want to be seen approaching the tent. The isolation of the tent had always been a comfort, but now it felt like a vulnerability. I hastened my steps, the sense of unease growing with each squelch of mud under my feet. Reaching the tent, nothing seemed amiss at first glance, but as I circled the site, a prickle of fear crawled up my spine when I spotted more footprints skirting the tree line, as if someone were trying to remain unseen. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, stalking around my tent? I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself I was being paranoid, but nightfall would bring terror to life. Lying in my sleeping bag, I began to hear soft, deliberate steps on the forest floor. Heart hammering against my ribs, I crept to the tent flap, peering out into the night. The moon cast a pale glow, revealing two figures at my truck. Anger overrode fear, and I quickly threw on my shoes and burst out of the tent, yelling into the night, "Hey, get away from there!" Before I even knew what happened, a gunshot shattered the silence, and a bullet zipped past the tent, mere inches away from where I stood. Survival instinct took over. I didn't think, I just acted. Bolting from the spot, I fled into the woods, the darkness enveloping me as I moved. Adrenaline surged through me, and I navigated through the night, using memory and instinct rather than sight. My only goal was to put as much distance as I could between myself and the danger. I ran until I couldn't run any further, and I began to worry that I might get lost in the dark woods. I found a stump and knelt down, hoping the individuals in my campsite would not pursue me. When morning finally broke, I slowly and cautiously made my way back to the campsite. My truck had been broken into, and everything of value was taken. Whoever the men were, though, they were gone. Fortunately for me, my keys and cell phone were still in the pockets of my pants, which were inside the tent where I had left them. I wasted no time. I quickly gathered some essentials and exited the woods, determined to avoid another confrontation with those men. Once I managed to get back to an area with cell service, I immediately called the authorities. Unfortunately, the men were never found. The authorities conducted thorough searches, but aside from a few footprints, no trace of them could be uncovered. Their presence, like a bad dream, faded off into the woods, leaving questions that I'll unfortunately never get answers to. This incident undeniably stands as the scariest camping encounter I've ever had, casting a dark shadow over what was once a sanctuary in the wilderness. Though I won't let it deter me from going back out into the woods, I hope, with every ounce of my being, that I'll never experience anything like it again.